In the winter of 1482, a chilling vow echoed through the marble halls of the Castilian court. A vow so grotesque, so unthinkably extreme, that it would stain not only the body of a queen, but the legacy of a nation. Queen Isabella of Castile was no ordinary monarch. Revered by her supporters as a pious defender of Christendom and feared by her enemies as a relentless force of political will, she stood at the threshold of Spain's final conquest against the Moors of Granada. But it was not a sword or a decree that would make her infamous. It was an undergarment, and a vow that would transform cloth into a symbol of spiritual fanaticism. Before her courtiers, clergy, and military leaders, Isabella reportedly declared that she would not change her chemise, the linen garment worn closest to the skin, until the last Muslim stronghold on the Iberian Peninsula fell into Christian hands. This was not a temporary gesture, nor a private act of penance. It was a public performance of divine obsession, delivered with theatrical piety and sealed with the name of the Virgin Mary. To understand the horror of this act, one must first understand the time. In medieval Europe, hygiene was already a rarity. Most nobles changed their linen undergarments weekly, while the poor might wear the same ones for months. But even by 15th century standards, Isabella's vow was extreme. The idea of going weeks without changing clothing was unpleasant. The idea of going years, nearly a decade, was unthinkable. Yet for Isabella it was more than a vow. It was a transformation. She would not just conquer Granada. She would become a vessel of divine suffering, a martyr of flesh and fabric. Her body, she believed, would bear the burden of God's war. But as the years passed, that burden began to rot. The once pure white linen began to yellow with sweat, to darken with blood, to stiffen with filth. It clung to her body like a second skin. One of decay, not devotion. The stench became unbearable. Her courtiers dared not flinch. Her ladies-in-waiting suffered in silence. Foreign emissaries would later write of a queen who moved like a holy relic but reeked like a battlefield corpse. What began as an act of sacred resistance became a disease, one that would spread through her court, her kingdom, and her very soul. Isabella's vow was not simply about not changing clothes. It was about refusing to let go of pain, of power, of punishment. And as the Reconquista dragged on, so too did the smell of death that followed her. Not from war, but from within her very skin. The queen had become her own weapon and her own wound. This was only the beginning. By the standards of 15th century Europe, an age when soap was rare, baths were suspect, and foul odors were seen as a fact of life, Queen Isabella's vow was still an anomaly. Poor hygiene was one thing. Absolute, unwavering filth for nearly a decade was another. As the years passed and the Reconquista dragged on, the queen's once pristine chemise, once as white as fresh snow, began to transform. Sweat, blood, and other bodily fluids soaked into the fabric, staining it in layers that deepened from yellow to brown to near black. The linen clung to her skin, no longer cloth, but a membrane of filth. What had started as an act of holy devotion had now become a grotesque second skin. Physicians at court began to whisper. They could not speak openly. To do so would be to question the will of God as embodied in the queen. But in carefully coded notes and obscure medical phrases, they documented what they could. Lesions along the shoulders and back, raw skin under the arms, ulcerations along the thighs. The constant chafing of dirty fabric had broken the skin in countless places. These wounds, untreated and unwashed, had festered. Insects and parasites, lice, fleas, perhaps worse, found a permanent home within the folds of the decaying chemise. It was said that even when Isabella moved through breezy courtyards, the air around her remained still, weighed down by an invisible cloud of stench and corruption. The stench was no longer just a smell. It was a force, a presence, something thick enough to part crowds and silence rooms. The queen's body had become a vessel of divine punishment, not against others, but against herself. Her skin blistered. Her immune system, overwhelmed, began to fail. Minor infections spread unchecked. Scratches became ulcers. Bruises became necrotic patches. All of it hidden beneath the regal robes, beneath the symbols of Christian triumph. Yet still, she refused to abandon the vow. This was no longer just about faith. This was about will, about obsession, about control. Isabella was decaying not just physically but spiritually. Her once radiant presence had dimmed. Her voice, once strong and decisive, now rasped through dry lips and congested lungs. Her fingers trembled when she gripped her scepter. Her courtiers noticed. Her attendants noticed. The stench, the sores, the growing silence in her presence. All were signs that something within their queen had begun to rot. And yet they bowed. They smiled. They praised her holy endurance. Because to acknowledge the decay would be to admit that perhaps this wasn't piety. It was madness. In the name of purity, she had surrendered her body to infection. In the name of holiness, she had allowed her flesh to die slowly upon her bones. Isabella of Castile, the pious queen, the mother of Spain, had become her own martyr, not slain by sword or flame, but by the very vow she had sworn in the name of God. The queen who had once been hailed for her sharp intellect and measured governance was beginning to unravel. Slowly, quietly, and then all at once. Queen Isabella of Castile, formerly composed, strategic, and revered, began to show signs of mental collapse. Her unwavering vow of sanctified filth, once seen as a symbol of divine endurance, now revealed a deeper, more disturbing truth. The woman who ruled a nation was no longer ruling herself. The obsession with spiritual purity had spiraled into something pathological. She became increasingly fixated on ritual cleanliness in all things, except herself. Dishes had to be washed 3 times with blessed water. Candles had to be lit in perfect symmetry. Prayer schedules were enforced with military discipline. Yet, beneath her royal robes, the same decaying chemise remained pressed against her skin, a silent contradiction to the purity she so desperately preached. The court began to suffer. Protocol demanded that nobles and clergy remain close to the queen during state functions, ceremonies, and mass. But her presence was no longer merely imposing, it was unbearable. The stench was not simply offensive, it was overpowering. Attendees at court events fought off nausea, burning eyes, and shortness of breath. Some developed chronic respiratory problems. Others quietly fell ill. Whispers of the queen's condition began to circulate through foreign embassies and noble houses like a contagion. But no one dared speak aloud. Those who expressed even the faintest discomfort, who turned their heads, wrinkled their noses, or failed to bow deeply enough, were swiftly punished. Some were banished. Others were stripped of titles. A few vanished entirely from court records. Silence became survival. Within the palace walls, a surreal play unfolded daily. Courtiers smiled through clenched teeth. Bishops delivered sermons with hollow reverence. Ambassadors delivered messages through scented cloths discreetly held to their faces. Musicians played over coughing fits. Physicians offered herbal incense under the guise of religious offerings. The throne room, once a place of power, now resembled a theater of denial. The queen, increasingly detached from reality, believed that her suffering was sanctified. She mistook her isolation for divine elevation. Every wince, every bowed head, every tremble in her presence she read as reverence, not revulsion. And so, the charade continued. Behind closed doors, her counselors wept. In private letters, they confessed fears for her mind, for her soul, and for the fate of the realm. But in public, they knelt. The court had become a kingdom of illusion, its leader rotting in body, unraveling in mind, yet still worshipped as a vessel of holy grace. The plague within the palace was not just of flesh or scent. It was a moral decay, a collective madness that demanded everyone participate in the fiction that nothing was wrong. But the truth clung to them all, like the reeking linen that clung to their queen. The year was 1492. The banners of Castile and Aragon rose above the citadel of Granada, marking the end of centuries-long conflict. The last Muslim stronghold had fallen. For Spain, it was hailed as divine victory. For Queen Isabella, it was the fulfillment of a vow paid not in bloodshed alone, but in the slow, gruesome collapse of her own flesh. As trumpets sounded and churches rang their bells in triumph, behind palace doors, a darker scene unfolded. The queen, too weak to walk unaided, was carried into her private chambers. There was no jubilation in her voice. There was only breathless silence and the shallow rasp of a body pushed beyond its breaking point. The chemise, the same linen undergarment she had worn for nearly a decade, was no longer a garment. It had fused into her skin, its fibers embedded in infected tissue. It had become part of her, a second skin of rot and ruin. When her attendants attempted to remove it, they found it tore away layers of flesh with it, leaving raw, open wounds. The pain was excruciating. The bleeding was unstoppable. Court physicians, long forced to speak in riddles and euphemisms, were now faced with an unavoidable truth. Their queen was dying not of war nor old age, but of religious obsession taken to its most literal, self-consuming end. They noted signs of sepsis: fever, delirium, skin mottled with bruises, and pus weeping from beneath the linen that had once been white. Her immune system, battered by years of chronic infection and poor circulation, had all but collapsed. Every minor scratch had turned into an abscess. Every sore became an entry point for disease. The royal chambers, once perfumed and gilded, reeked of antiseptics, rot, and the iron tang of blood. And yet, even in this state, Isabella refused to accept that her suffering was in vain. To her, the agony was righteous. The filth, the wounds, the festering garment, all of it had become sacred. She had offered her body as a sacrifice, and in her mind it had worked. Granada had fallen. The Catholic banner flew high. Her vow had been honored. But the price was irreversible. Scars covered her body. Some wounds refused to close. Fever dreams overtook her sleep, and hallucinations crept into her waking hours. The queen who once commanded armies now lay helpless, cloaked in blood-stained linens, surrounded by fearful whispers and exhausted healers. The fall of Granada had not crowned her in glory. It had reduced her to something barely human, part relic, part ruin. She had become the embodiment of her own fanaticism, her faith etched into every wound, her victory written in the collapse of her own flesh. The war for Spain had ended, but the war within the queen's body had just begun. The fall of Granada was only the beginning. As Queen Isabella's body deteriorated behind closed doors, her policies began to mirror the rot festering beneath her skin. What had once been private decay now spilled into public cruelty. What had been self-inflicted suffering transformed into mass persecution. Just months after the Christian victory over Granada, Isabella issued one of the most infamous edicts in European history, the Alhambra Decree. It demanded that all Jews in Spain either convert to Christianity or face immediate expulsion. Families who had lived on Iberian soil for centuries were given mere weeks to abandon their homes, their livelihoods, and their dead. Their properties were seized. Their synagogues were destroyed. Their lives were erased. This was not an isolated act of religious zeal. It was a systemic purge. Thousands refused to convert. They were branded heretics. And under Isabella's rule, heresy had only one destination: the fire. The Spanish Inquisition, once a quiet tool of control, now blazed with unholy fury. Torture chambers echoed with the screams of the accused. Public squares became execution grounds. Burnings at the stake, autos de fe, were turned into ritualistic performances, cloaked in the language of divine justice. Isabella herself attended these ceremonies, seated on a throne like a high priestess of purification. And all of it, every flame, every exile, every twisted limb, traced its origin to the queen's obsession with purity. Her own flesh had decayed in the name of spiritual cleansing. Now she demanded that the kingdom do the same. Court chroniclers and foreign ambassadors could not ignore the paradox. The queen who sat in judgment of the impure reeked of unwashed filth. The woman who spoke of holy light brought shadows wherever she passed. Her voice, once resolute and sharp, had become hoarse with illness. Her body trembled. Her gaze, they said, no longer looked at people but through them, and yet none dared defy her. Isabella's policies were a projection of her internal collapse. Her refusal to purge her own infection had transformed into an obsession with purging others. Her rotting garment became the emblem of a nation consumed by its own hatred. From beneath her decaying skin rose the flames that would engulf hundreds of thousands. She saw it all as sacrifice, necessary suffering for divine reward. But Spain would suffer for centuries because of it. A queen once admired for unity had become the architect of division. Her twisted piety birthed a legacy of cruelty so vast, it would stain not only her own soul, but the conscience of a nation. Isabella's body may have rotted in silence, but her edicts screamed across history. And in every ash-covered square where innocents were burned, the scent of sanctity was indistinguishable from the stench of flesh. As Queen Isabella's body continued to deteriorate in private, her influence over the future of the world grew in ways she could scarcely imagine. In the dim corridors of her court, while physicians whispered of infections and priests recited prayers for her failing health, negotiations were underway that would forever change the map of history. Christopher Columbus, an ambitious navigator with radical ideas, had been turned away from court after court. But in Castile, he found a queen consumed by a divine vision, one who saw Christian destiny not only in conquest over Muslims and Jews, but across unknown oceans. Isabella, weakened and wrapped in cloth still stained by her vow, approved his voyage. But the gold that would fund this journey did not come from the royal treasury. It came from the expelled, the exiled Jewish families, stripped of their possessions under the Alhambra decree, had unwittingly become financiers of empire. Their confiscated jewelry, silverware, and property were melted, sold, and redirected, not to aid the poor, not to feed the kingdom, but to build ships. The same hands that lit the torches at the Autos de Fe now filled the coffers of discovery. And the victims of the Spanish Inquisition, their fates fed the sails as well. As heretics were tortured in dungeons and burned in public squares, their homes, land, and belongings were seized by the crown. It was blood money, taken from screams and ashes, converted into timber, canvas, and crewmen's wages. Isabella viewed the voyage as holy expansion, not colonial conquest but spiritual crusade. If God had granted her victory over the Muslims of Granada, then he would surely grant her dominion over distant pagans. She believed it was not just her right, but her duty to bring salvation to the unknown world. Columbus departed in 1492, the same year Jews were expelled and Granada fell. A year that should have marked peace and glory instead became a gateway to centuries of exploitation and genocide. What began as a crossing of seas became a wave of destruction. Entire civilizations would fall to the sword and to the cross. Indigenous peoples would be enslaved, their gods destroyed, their lands soaked in foreign blood. All launched under the blessing of a queen whose body bore the wounds of piety and the stench of zealotry. Historians would later marvel at the timing. How in a single year, Isabella achieved both the completion of the Reconquista and the beginning of global conquest. But beneath the victories lay a grim truth. The foundations of empire were built not on strength or ingenuity, but on confiscation, persecution, and the silent screams of the innocent. From the rot of her own flesh to the flames of her own Inquisition, Isabella had harvested a kingdom ready for expansion, and used its pain to send ships into the horizon. The New World was not born from royal vision. It was born from blood, smoke, and the rattling of broken chains. As Queen Isabella's health declined and her body deteriorated beyond recognition, her court followed her into the abyss. What had once been a place of governance became a theater of fanaticism. No longer ruled by reason or diplomacy, the palace walls echoed with rituals of self-denial, torment, and blind devotion. Her example had become doctrine. In a grotesque display of loyalty, nobles and advisors began to emulate her suffering. Some fasted to the brink of collapse. Others beat themselves with leather whips during nightly prayers, their backs raw and bleeding, public proof of spiritual obedience. Ministers chanted through tears, flagellants paraded through court halls, and even royal guards carried rosaries with hands calloused from penance. The queen's decaying flesh had become the sacred symbol of sacrifice. Her madness infected them all. None dared speak against it. The atmosphere within the court was suffocating. To question Isabella's rituals was to blaspheme. To express doubt was to betray the crown and God alike. Reason was drowned beneath incense and blood. Logic gave way to spectacle. And so the empire hollowed. With every act of blind piety, Spain grew weaker. Its coffers, once filled by conquest, were drained by endless rituals and persecution. Intellectuals fled or were silenced. Jewish and Muslim scholars, merchants, and physicians, pillars of Spanish society, were gone. Trade routes stalled. Famine crept into villages. Entire towns withered under heavy taxation and theological oppression. Then, in 1504, Isabella died. Her passing should have brought peace. Instead, it unleashed chaos. Without her, the fragile structure of fanatical control began to collapse. Factions warred over succession. Nobles plotted. Her daughter, Joanna, haunted by the shadows of her mother's extremism, was crowned but quickly declared insane. Power shifted between warring hands. Spain, once unified under Isabella's iron rule, fractured like a stained-glass window struck from behind. The Inquisition remained, of course. Its fires burned even brighter, as if to preserve her legacy through flame. But what it preserved was fear, not strength. The population shrank. The economy withered. Science, art, and culture stagnated. The golden age that Isabella dreamed of never came. All that remained was a kingdom built on ashes. Historians would later speak of Isabella as a powerful queen, a builder of nations, a devout believer. But the truth whispered behind closed doors was darker. She had poisoned the roots of her own dynasty. Her legacy was not a crown of glory, but a shroud of fanaticism. Not a flourishing empire, but a nation crippled by superstition, violence, and decay. She had not just destroyed her body in the name of God. She had trained an entire kingdom to do the same. And when she was gone, the rot she had sown did not die with her. It lived on, in every broken institution, every empty library, every silenced voice. A queen who ruled by faith left behind only ruin. Long after Queen Isabella's bones had turned to dust, the ruins of her reign continued to whisper dark truths. Centuries later, modern archaeologists and epidemiologists began to unearth physical remnants of the world she left behind, and what they found only deepened the horror. Within the crumbling walls of former royal residences, palaces where Isabella once prayed, ruled, and decayed, traces of biological catastrophe remained. Soil samples taken from beneath stone floors showed high concentrations of bacteria, parasites, and toxins. Microscopic evidence revealed the presence of pathogens linked to lice-borne diseases and skin infections, conditions made rampant by the unsanitary environment she had cultivated through her infamous vow. Her refusal to change garments for nearly a decade had not only ravaged her own body, but likely turned her surroundings into incubators of infection. Bedding, curtains, clothing, and even prayer kneelers retained chemical traces of decay and contamination. The queen's quarters had become a royal biohazard. But the legacy of her extremism extended far beyond bacteria. It seeped into bloodlines. Her daughter, Joanna of Castile, later known to history as Joanna the Mad, grew up under the heavy shadow of her mother's fanaticism. As a child, Joanna was made to witness acts of piety that blurred the line between faith and self-torture. She was told that suffering brought sanctity, that silence was strength, that the body was a prison to be conquered by prayer and pain. By adulthood, Joanna was brilliant, devout, and deeply unstable. Historical records describe her as prone to violent mood swings, deep paranoia, and hallucinations. Some historians believe she suffered from inherited mental illness. Others suggest she was simply broken by the toxic mixture of isolation, trauma, and impossible expectations. After her mother's death, Joanna's mental decline accelerated. She would spend much of her life locked away, a queen in title but a prisoner in body and mind. Modern psychologists have speculated on the intergenerational trauma passed down from Isabella. Her court was a place where fear replaced reason and obedience outweighed truth. Children were raised in silence, taught to ignore what they saw, to believe what they were told, even as bodies collapsed and the air turned sour with rot. In such a world, madness was not a condition. It was a survival tactic. Isabella's death in 1504 did not bring healing. Her spiritual poison lingered like mold in the corners of her former chambers, infecting those who remained. Her devotion had become disease. Her crown passed on, but the cost of wearing it only grew heavier. In the end, Isabella's true legacy was not glory, nor piety, nor empire. It was contagion in mind, in body, and in blood. A queen who ruled through obsession left behind a world unable to forget her, and unable to recover from her. Queen Isabella of Castile did not merely destroy her own body with her infamous vow. She sanctified a blueprint for generations of religious extremism. Her suffering was not contained within flesh. It became myth, and that myth was weaponized. Her vow, once whispered in a dimly lit court before the final siege of Granada, was elevated to legend. A queen who had worn the same undergarment for nearly a decade in the name of divine victory became, in the eyes of fanatics, a symbol of spiritual martyrdom. But behind the veil of sacrifice was something darker, a precedent. Her self-inflicted torment gave moral cover to cruelty committed not against herself, but against others. Isabella's name would be invoked again and again, not to inspire mercy or piety, but to justify pain. In the centuries that followed, inquisitors, monarchs, and priests carried out acts of persecution under the shadow of her legacy. The Spanish Inquisition swelled in scope and brutality, fueled by the idea that suffering could be sacred and violence could be divine. Torture chambers expanded beneath cathedrals. Families vanished in the night. Children were indoctrinated, taught to see purity not as love, but as conformity and fear. It was all done in her name. Even as her body rotted behind palace walls, her face adorned altarpieces. Her image, painted in gold leaf and marble, stood beneath the soaring arches of churches funded by the stolen wealth of expelled Jews and tortured heretics. The same coins that built these sanctuaries had been torn from the hands of the condemned. Every stained glass window that glowed with saintly light hid the truth. Faith had become a machine, and Isabella was its engine. Historians would later romanticize her as a unifier of Spain, a holy queen, a mother of empire. But the foundation she laid was soaked in blood. She had elevated blind obedience to the level of virtue, and in doing so, gave license to centuries of unrelenting cruelty. The vow itself, not to change her chemise until the Reconquista was complete, was not just a private promise. It became a doctrine, a warning, and a banner. It told the world, the body is expendable, truth is malleable, and extremism, if wrapped in sanctity, will be praised. And so the churches she built stood tall, towering monuments of stone, gold, and false righteousness. They drew pilgrims. They inspired prayers. But if one listened closely, behind the organ hymns and incense smoke, the silence screamed. It screamed with the agony of those burned at the stake, with the footsteps of the exiled, with the coughs of prisoners rotting in underground cells. Isabella's vow had not saved her soul. It had condemned a nation. Her greatest legacy was not Spain united, but Spain blinded. A queen remembered not for what she healed, but for what she gave others permission to destroy. Queen Isabella of Castile did not merely rule an empire. She became a warning etched in flesh and memory, a haunting emblem of what happens when power is left unchecked and religious devotion is warped into obsession. Her vow, made in the name of divine purity, began as a theatrical gesture. A queen who would not change her undergarment until Granada fell. At first, it was seen as admirable, even saintly, a testament to her resolve, a symbol of self-sacrifice. But as the years passed and her body began to rot beneath the chemise, the vow transformed into something else entirely. What once seemed sacred became grotesque. Isabella's story is not simply about physical decay. It is about moral collapse, the unraveling of judgment, the corrosion of empathy, and the weaponization of belief. Her refusal to tend to her own suffering was not a form of strength. It was a foreshadowing. As her body withered in silence, so too did her capacity for mercy. The queen who could ignore her own bleeding skin could just as easily ignore the screams of others. The line between martyr and monster blurred. Her fanaticism became institutional. Her rotting undergarment, hidden beneath layers of royal silk, was mirrored in the policies she dressed in regal decree. Torture, expulsion, forced conversion, mass executions. In her pursuit of religious purity, she turned a kingdom into a furnace. Entire communities were erased. Intellectual life withered. Heretics burned while bells rang in celebration. And all of it was called holy. Even after her death, the myth persisted. Statues were built. Churches bore her name. Historians whitewashed her legacy into sainthood. But beneath the gold and marble lies a darker truth, that Isabella's legacy is not one of faith, but of fanaticism dressed in faith's disguise. She is not remembered merely for uniting Spain. She is remembered, or should be, for uniting cruelty with conviction, and for showing how a woman once celebrated as Europe's most powerful monarch could descend into self-destruction and drag an entire empire with her. Her story stands as a grim allegory, that even the noblest intentions, when divorced from compassion and self-awareness, can become engines of horror. A vow meant to glorify God became a decade-long breeding ground for disease. A queen meant to uplift her people presided over centuries of suffering. And a symbol meant to inspire faith became a grotesque relic of unrelenting control. In the end, Isabella's legacy is not simply historical, it is psychological. She reminds us how fragile the boundary is between piety and pathology, how quickly belief can rot when wrapped in ego, and how a single vow, left unchallenged, can mutate into something that poisons not only the body, but the soul of a nation. Between saint and monster lies a shadow, and in that shadow stands Isabella, silent, sanctified, and irreversibly stained.